Hello and welcome to another video about the early modern period. In this video we are going to advise or learn the government responses to the plague epidemics of the early modern period. I thought it'd be worth then kicking off by just having a look at the three key monarchs that make changes to public health in the early modern period. Hopefully you recognise these people. Yes, no, maybe. The first one is Henry VIII, and then we have his daughter Elizabeth I, and the third one being James I. Now, these three monarchs are the ones that we study in our course, so these three are the ones that make the biggest changes to the early modern period in terms of responses to the epidemic of the plagues. Before we get into exactly what these three monarchs did, we need to just get our heads around local and national government as a whole. There is a future video on this which talks about these in a little bit more detail, but when I'm teaching you during this video I'm going to refer to several different key words, and you just need to have an idea of who these people are. So hopefully we know the King and Queen, would be known as the monarch. Parliament is split up into two parts, the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and they pass laws, particularly the laws that they passed were related to raising money via tax. This changed a little bit later as they become more involved in public health. We have a mayor who is who's in charge of the town, so this is an example of local government rather than national government. We have an alderman who is an early version of a town councillor, the town council themselves. We might recognise this from modern local government. So this is a group of people who are elected to run the local government. They're in charge of local issues, local public health problems as well. And then we've got the town corporation, which are very similar to the town council, and these are a group of usually everyday people who are elected to run the town alongside the town council, or they run a local organisation as well. Before we move on then, just a bit of an overview of the kings and queens of the national government, because the monarchs are the national government. There's no prime minister. The House of Commons and the House of Lords very rarely have any power. Anything that the House of Commons and House of Lords want to pass has to go through the monarch until maybe the Civil War, where Parliament gets more power. Just to point you in the direction of where our monarchs sit, our three key monarchs for the responses to early modern epidemics, we've got Henry VIII, his son Edward VI, who doesn't pass any restrictions. Mary I doesn't either, they don't reign for very long. Elizabeth does, and then we've got James I. These monarchs, we know from learning about them in Year 8, however they don't have any influence on public health as far as we're concerned for our course. Before we move any further then, I would like you to set up your book ready to complete some notes. If you are revising using this video, then this is an optional task for you. However, if this is the first time that you are learning this topic, then you must do this task. So across a double page, you will need to create 3 small mind maps. Henry VIII needs to be small and James I needs to be quite small, hence why I've said put Elizabeth's mind map across the middle, and then Henry and then James at the top and bottom, because you're going to need more space for Elizabeth's plague orders. Make it look something along these lines, and when you're ready, continue with this video and we can start to add some information to your mind maps. So we're going to go chronologically, so we'll start off with Henry VIII and how he as a national government responded to the early modern epidemics. So at this point we're at Henry VIII 1518, so that's when his changes occur, and his changes are built around this idea of isolation, so isolating victims of the plague and also identifying them. Now Henry gets his ideas from Europe, he hears about other monarchs and other national governments doing isolation and identifying plague victims, and he says we're going to do that in England too. That's a good idea, I like that. So isolating victims, but more importantly identifying who they are. So infected houses, they were clearly marked with usually a red cross. And anyone who left the house and had the plague, they had to carry a white stick to identify them, so that meant that people wouldn't come in close contact with them. Not a bad idea, really. So this is the start of a national policy on public health in England. So Henry sets the groundwork for his daughter and then James I to be getting involved in public health and as a national government and wanting to improve public health for people. So he's kind of sets the groundwork for this, so really, really important. Some of his other changes then as a result of this, so the first idea he has is this royal proclamation where he says everyone must isolate if you have symptoms, and then it's the white stick and the houses being identified. Well, he takes that a step further and he starts to work with local governments as well. So from 1518 then, the mayors and the aldermen in all of England's towns were expected to take action when the plague struck. So he's almost delegating it out to local councils as well. Some town councils started to isolate plague victims in something known as pest houses. So these were actual places where if you had the plague you would be isolated, so not to pass it on to more people, not to pass it on to the rest of your family. Like I said, these were known as pest houses. During the 1500s then, so this is a specific example for your spider diagram, and this is a case study of York in particular, so it doesn't necessarily happen in other local governments, but this happens in York in the 1550s. So the aldermen introduced something called watchmen on the Ouse Bridge to stop the movement of infected people. So looking for people that have symptoms and saying, no, you need to be in a pest house, or no, you need to be at home, isolating so you're not spreading the disease. So watchmen usually would sit outside people's houses making sure they didn't leave the house if they had the plague. We also get searchers and they bury the dead, and they go around searching people's houses to see if the person has died, and then clear their body, clear the house, and then it's okay for their families to return if that was the situation they were in. And in York they funded this, because all these people are getting paid, they funded this by asking for donations to the parish, so parishes being areas around a church, that's how local places were split up. And also this money went towards paying the watchmen, paying the searchers, but also providing food to people that were living in infected houses. So if you were ill with the Black Death, with the plague, then you could still get some food. It wasn't just that kind of you perished, and it was a really awful experience. So very, very forward thinking in terms of helping with public health, I would say. So take this opportunity then, pause the video, add this information to your mind map on Henry VIII. Our second national government or monarch is Elizabeth I and her plague orders in 1578. So the plague orders then were an actual set of rules that you had to follow because of how many epidemics were occurring. And this was all made possible because of the invention of the printing press. So they were written down rules, they were shared across England so that everyone had the same message. The Plague Orders of 1578 contained 17 rules that justices of the peace, so these are like sheriffs or like the head of crime and trying to make sure that there is order in a town or area, that's the justice of the peace, and the aldermen had to enforce at the times of the plague. So they would go around making sure that everyone was following these 17 rules. Local authorities, they stuck copies of the orders on people's doors and on posts around the towns for people to see. So it was really good way of getting the message out, really. Some examples of the plague orders are justices of the peace and the aldermen should meet once every 3 weeks during an epidemic to discuss progress and next steps. The alderman was to collect money to support the sick in their town, so building on the ideas of Henry VIII. Viewers or searchers, which were pretty much the same thing, were to be appointed to report on how the infection was developing. Almost, it sounds like quite scientific, that, doesn't it? So kind of scientifically recording deaths of the plague, so a real step forward. Special prayers to be said in church, not as good, less scientific. Streets and alleys to be cleared thoroughly and barrels of tar to be burned in the streets. Miasma related, isn't it? So it's related to the fact they think miasma is causing it. No dogs cats or tame pigeons allowed in the streets. Again, they were thinking these animals were spreading the plague, so it feels like a little bit of a step backwards. Clothes and bedding of plague victims to be burned. Not a bad idea, because these things would have been full of fleas and lice and would have spread the plague further. Funerals to take part at dusk to reduce those attending. That's a really, really good idea. So happening, on a night is going to mean that there's not going to be as many people in the street kind of passing family members that may already have the plague. Infected houses in towns to be completely shut up for 6 weeks with all members of the family, sick or healthy, inside, and watchmen, who are people that make sure that people are following the plague orders, are to enforce this. This is the most controversial part of Elizabeth's plague orders. So if you imagine Henry VIII isolated, single people, Elizabeth said, no, whole families. If one person in your family gets the plague, you have got to be locked up with the rest of your family, meaning that whole families then died. This was really hard to enforce and not a very popular rule. The last order, as I said, was very, very strict. So take this opportunity. You might want to rewind the video back just to take notes on the previous slide and add the information about Elizabeth to your mind map. Finally then, James I and his response to the plague epidemics in 1604. So he had Parliament pass a law to enforce the new plague orders. So I think Henry VIII, isolation. Elizabeth, isolation of full families. James, making sure that all of the rules are enforced, and we're going to see what he does to do that. So the Plague Act of 1604 actually extended help to the sick families, so a little bit further than Elizabeth did, and we know that Henry kick-started that. It allowed towns to collect money from parishes within a radius of 5 miles from the town, so collecting more money from churchgoers and the whole country if necessary to help those that were sick and poor. But he introduced harsh punishments for anyone who was breaking the policy of isolation. So if you weren't isolating in your full family as implemented by Elizabeth I, then you would be severely punished. A plague victim found outside of their house mingling with people could be hanged, and a healthy person who left an infected house which should be shut up, so you should be locked up with your full family, could be whipped. These are obviously quite harsh responses to the plague orders and people not following them. But yes, something else for you to jot down onto your mind map. Finally then, to summarise, we have Henry VIII in 1518. He issued a royal order proclamation using the European measure of isolation, so telling everyone to isolate or identify yourself as someone with the plague. Elizabeth I, 1578, takes Henry's ideas one step further. In the plague orders of 1578, asks for the isolation of full families. There are some good ideas from Elizabeth in terms of helping the sick and making local councils more responsible for public health. However, there were also some archaic, old, unhelpful orders such as saying special prayers in church. James I in 1604 then, he builds on the ideas of the two previous monarchs, and he introduces harsh punishments for non-compliance. So if you are not following the plague orders, then you were punished by either hanging or being whipped. And this is all outlined in the Plague Act of 1604. There are also some positives in that he extended the help provided to sick families by collecting money from parishes.